Welcome back. We're back in our study of the book of Proverbs. We're on week chapter 3. We're looking at Proverbs 3:13 through 35 today, and as we look at this, we're going to be challenged specifically in verses 21 through 35, but the entire passage, 13 through 35, is a poem that Solomon writes and addresses to his son, understanding that he is charging this one who is going to be a future ruler of Israel, a future leader in Israel. And so he's charging him with how he behaves and his choices, and he tells him how important his need is for wisdom. And so we looked at the first week, and we're just going to briefly remind ourselves this week the realities of wisdom. Wisdom is the intellect plus ability. Wisdom is intellect plus practical living, and wisdom is intellect plus understanding the purposes of our lives. In other words, there's three basic levels of wisdom as we look at Scripture. That which deals with just human ability, physical, mental ability. That which deals with choices, practical living, which is what we're looking at here in the book of Proverbs. And then that which deals with the existential, like what we cannot see, like why am I alive, and why do I have this happening, and why is this going on in the world around us. And so this book is designed as a very practical book, and I have been reminded just this past week of how much truth is there, how much opportunity is there for us to see. And so we're not going to cover the entire poem today, which, like I said, is 13 through 35, but we are going to kick it off in verse 21. And so I'm going to read verses 21 through 26 as we jump right into this passage, and we're going to look at three things today that wisdom either gives us as a gift, prohibits us from, or protects us from. So here we go in Proverbs 3, verse 21. Maintain sound wisdom and discretion. My son, don't lose sight of them. They will be life for you and adornment for your neck. Then you will go safely on your way. Your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. You will lie down, and your sleep will be pleasant. Don't fear sudden danger or the ruin of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from a snare. So Solomon is writing to his son here, and he is saying to his son that wisdom, practical living, good, practical, God-honoring choices will bring you some gifts. And so I want us to look at one of those gifts today, and I'm going to use this word to describe it. And the word that I think describes this is the word balance. So I want you to visualize a seesaw. Maybe you sat on one as a child. Maybe you played on one as a child. And you understand how it works. You have the fulcrum in the middle, and then you have the board that extends. And the way that a seesaw correctly works is when two people sit on either side of it that are of approximately similar weights, and they can go up and down and have an enjoyable time together. A seesaw does not work if you remove one person from the equation, and it normally does not work without a lot of extra effort if the two people are of two greatly different sizes. But appropriately used, a seesaw is a great gift. It's there in playgrounds all over the world, and kids have enjoyed them. Well, so too, wisdom gives us some great gifts, and it gives us some great balance. And so here's what happens of it. Like as we read through verses 21 through 26, we see it. The first thing we have is this word competence and discretion. And from that I got this word balance. Okay, so we have this ability to really weigh and understand the possibilities that are being presented in our lives and in the world around us. Okay, think of, for example, a seesaw. Go back to the illustration of a seesaw and two children on a seesaw enjoying the seesaw. Now let's suppose one of them says, you know what, I think you're having more fun on your side over there, So I'm going to bring this cinder block over here, and I'm going to put it on the seesaw with me. And myself and the seesaw are going to enjoy this, or myself and the cinder block are going to enjoy the seesaw more. In other words, you begin to tilt the seesaw in your favor. And maybe that doesn't give you what you want, so you add another cinder block to it, and you add another cinder block to it. And pretty soon what happens is the seesaw is completely changed, and it only is working for one person. And by the way, when it only works for one person, the seesaw doesn't actually work at all. Okay, what did you end up with is something that looks like this. The fulcrum, one down here on the bottom and the other end sticking way up in the air. Now, that's not working for either person. Well, Solomon says that wisdom brings us balance. Friends, if you and I have ever needed balance, we need balance today in our lives. We need it in everything. We need it in the way we respond to others. We need it in the way that we take in what others say to us. We need balance. So how does it give us balance? Well, the first thing it does is it gives life. It says they will be life for you and adornment for your neck. And the idea there of life is actually breath. It is actually the oxygen that is coming in and out of yours and my mouth. It is the ability to literally breathe. That word, the Hebrew word interpreted, simply means breath. Now, I want you to think about something, and I think back of the first 3 minutes of this video. I didn't breathe very much. Wisdom gives us opportunity to breathe, which means it gives us opportunity to slow down. Not only does it give us opportunity to breathe, but it gives us confidence. Because he says this, then you will go safely on your way, your foot will not stumble. In other words, as we allow ourselves to be shaped by what God is bringing into our lives and what is happening in the world around us, as we allow ourselves to be shaped by that, and we begin to trust in God instead of being retaliatory and angry and frustrated and mad all the time, what ends up happening is we get this confidence in our step. And you all know this. Confidence does so much for how we live our lives. Confidence. So it gives us confidence. One of the gifts of wisdom is confidence. The other thing is it gives security. Now, Solomon gives us a beautiful illustration, and he gives the illustration of going to sleep. The ability to lay down at the end of the night, at the end of the day, and rest. And it says this, your sleep will be pleasant. In other words, it'll be calm. It'll be a calming sleep, not full of nightmares and all these other problems. The second thing is you won't fear sudden danger. And the picture there, if you understand the time period in which he was writing this, is, they didn't have locks on their doors. They didn't have all these gates and security things that we have now. So going to sleep at night was dangerous. It was dangerous to be attacked by others. It was dangerous to be attacked by potentially wild animals and those sorts of things. He says you're not going to fear the sudden danger. Folks, myself, we can hear, and we can, as believers, if we're not careful, we can go anti to what Solomon is teaching us here. And we can talk and spend a lot of time dwelling on these fears that we have instead of trusting in the confidence of who God is. And here's where he translates it, how he rolls into it. He says, for the Lord will be your confidence and keep your foot from a snare. It's not that wisdom gives us the ability to say, well, that's not going to bother me. It's that wisdom gives us the ability to say, God is in control. And by the way, if we believe that God's in control, we're going to live like God's in control, which means things like Jesus taught us, like loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind, and then loving your neighbor as yourself. So wisdom gives us balance. Wisdom also brings prohibition. Now, you may recognize that word. You may have not used it much. Prohibition, when we think about prohibition in the United States of America, we specifically think back to the 20s when alcohol was banned in the U.S. And we think of that and we call that the Prohibition era. And the idea being that you could not have it, you could not consume it, it could not be sold, and all of those restrictions that came with it. Well, Solomon says this, if you have wisdom, then there are things that wisdom prohibits you from doing. Now buckle in, because this is an interesting ride. Verses starting at verse 27 and reading through verse 30. He says this, Let me get there to the right page. When it is in your power, don't withhold good from the one it belongs to. Don't say to your neighbor, go away. Come back later and I'll give it tomorrow, when it is there with you. Don't plan any harm against your neighbor, for he trusts you and lives near you. Don't accuse anyone without a cause when he has done you no harm. Now, Solomon says, first of all, wisdom gives you this great gift of balance. It gives you the wisdom of security and trusting in God. And then he takes an abrupt turn. He says, now, let me tell you something. Wisdom's got some prohibitions to it. It keeps us from doing certain things. And the first thing is this: prohibition of selfish gain. My uncle worked as a self-employed air conditioning man for many, many years, owned his own business. When he died and passed away, my father told me and my family, as we were sitting there one day, that there is no telling how much some of the wealthy businessmen in the town where my uncle lived and worked owed my uncle when he passed away. He was a self-employed man, a one-man operation operating out of the back of his own pickup truck. And they would call him, and he would go and he would fix their stuff, and, oh, I'll pay you next week or tomorrow, or why don't you come eat lunch in my restaurant and we'll count that as part of your pay and we'll catch up with you next week. The idea of someone who is living wisely, and in this situation, living wisely means trusting in the presence of God in their daily life, is this: that we pay those that we owe. You get a bill, you've got the money to pay it, you pay it. You pay those that you owe. What an incredible thought. And what Solomon is showing us here is this idea that what ends up happening in our lives is we set ourselves against our neighbor. And when we set ourselves against our neighbor, ultimately we set ourselves against God. And I want us to think about some of the things that we owe people. We owe them time. They are created in the image of God. We owe people time. We owe them respect. They are created in the image of God. Each person endowed by the Creator, as even I think it's the Bill of Rights says, with certain inalienable rights. At that time that was written, we didn't even recognize that as a country, but we wanted the idea of it. And we owe them respect. We owe them time. We owe them respect. We owe them space. And that's kind of a culmination of the two terms there of listening and being a respecter of where they're at and what they have experienced and what they have gone through. And I thought, my goodness, he says this, as he takes this verse and he breaks it out to us, he says, when it is in your power, don't withhold good from the one it belongs to. And think about the things that we have in our power, our time, the respect that we can give others, space that we can give others. And so what a wonderful view. Then he says it like this. He says, not only do you owe your neighbor, he says, don't not do what you could do. Don't say to your neighbor, go away. Come back later. I'll give it tomorrow when it is there with you. Think about our lives. Think about my life. Think about your life and how many times we say to people, listen, I really don't want to deal with you right now. And yet we could if we'd stop and we'd take the time when it is there with you. Because it begins to dissolve. And as you look at these 4 verses, 27 through 30, you see what we would refer to as degenerating behavior. The first thing is we don't pay the person that we owe. That's number 1. The second thing is that we don't treat the person who has a need with respect. That's the second thing. Look at where the third one goes. You see this behavior, it's a downhill slope. The third behavior is this: don't plan any harm against your neighbor. So we go from not paying somebody that we owe to not giving somebody time and space that they need to flat out planning harm against those around us. What an incredible thought as Solomon looks at the nature of man and says to us, hey, you better keep a sharp lookout because wisdom is going to keep you from doing these things. Don't plan harm against your neighbor. Think about those things. And one of the best ways to not plan harm against your neighbor is to realize who your neighbor is. And Jesus taught us that. Your neighbor is everyone. And I think in our lives, one of the best things we can do is plan to be proactive with our neighbors. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a store as an adult and come out of there and said, I can't even believe that cashier didn't speak to me. I can't believe that man didn't even acknowledge when I walked into his place of business. And you know what I was doing in that situation? I was doing something that have been taught as a business owner and a consumer. I have been taught that it is the responsibility of the business owner or the manager or the employee to care for the consumer. That's true. You're going to find that actually throughout the book of Proverbs as well, completely. But in this situation, Solomon's saying, set that aside and think of your neighbor. How many times have we said they were rude to me and yet we didn't speak to them? How many times have we not recognized that they may be going through difficulties in their life and we didn't seek to bring a kind word to them? And so the challenge for us is that we become proactive in addressing our neighbor. It's not just that we don't plan not to harm them, it's that we actually begin to plan good for them. That we look at them, we learn their names, we learn their situations, we learn their things. If you have a restaurant that you go to on a regular basis, I challenge you to know the names of the person behind the counter or the person waiting the table. Because what will happen is you're going to begin to be connected to that individual. And when you become connected to that individual, you begin to care about that individual and you begin to listen to them, you give them time, respect, and space. All of these things that we've talked about here. And then in verse 30, he says this, don't accuse anyone without cause when he has done you no harm. Transitions from the moment we just spoke about. This degenerating behavior leads to ultimately just sitting back and accusing everyone. You would think that Solomon was living in the 21st century. You would think that Solomon was sitting and watching the evolution of social media, the evolution of cable news networks that are simply there for their own profiteering. And by the way, when I say that, I mean all of them. Doesn't matter what initials they use to define them. They're all there for their personal profiteering. And so as they begin to do that, it's like Solomon's looking at that and he's saying, my goodness, this is what a world looks like. You and I, folks, are having an opportunity to live in that world. And the beauty of it is this. We have the opportunity to be different. We have the opportunity to live with wisdom, which means we don't accuse our neighbor. And one of the ways that we can accuse our neighbor, I want you to think about it for just a minute. Unfortunately, you and I have all seen the horrific things that have happened in our country with all of the different demonstrations that turned into riots and different things. But can I ask you something? Have you seen all of the ones that were not? Have you cared to see all of the ones that were not? Have you cared to see the ones that were terrible? Whichever side of the spectrum you fall on, are you willing to see the whole scenario? Did you know just this past 2 weekends ago in Waycross, we had a nice, large, peaceful demonstration of people that gathered. A few weeks ago on Saturday, I was down in Fernandina Beach. We had taken the kids and gone to Fort Clinch. And driving back through the city of Fernandina, there was a large demonstration in progress there in their city park that was, from the last I heard, went absolutely well. St. Augustine had one. All of these places are having these moments where people are sharing their frustrations and their fears and their desires, and they're happening peacefully. And then some are not. And unfortunately, depending on which side of the spectrum you fall in this situation, we sit back and falsely accuse our neighbors because we're only hearing one side of the story, whichever side that may be. So, he leads us to understand wisdom's prohibition. Now, wisdom's caution. And this one is probably the hardest one for me to run through and teach. Because the tendency is to say, that's not me, until it is. Until I do the behaviors. Verse 31, don't envy a violent man or choose any of his ways. For the devious are detestable to the Lord. For he is a friend to the upright, and the Lord's curse is on the household of the wicked. But he blesses the home of the righteous. He mocks those who mock, but gives grace to the humble. The wise will inherit honor, but he holds up fools to dishonor. He finishes this poem by issuing a caution. Remember, he starts it out with the promise, the gift. Then he says, here's the prohibition. But in the end, he brings us a caution. And the caution is this. And I think it is in light of what he's just said, because of what he has just shared in the previous verses. Some of us are right now shaking our heads and saying, I can't do that. If I do that, my friends and my family are going to walk all over me. People are going to mistreat me. If I don't stick up for myself and fight for what's right, I'm going to get walked all over. And because of that, we begin to envy the ways of the violent man, the man who gets what he wants. We begin to hold that up and say, that's the best way to handle things. And we begin to see retaliation as the only way to get what we desire. And he says this, understand how they got their wealth and realize that they'll do it to you as well. Don't envy a violent man or choose any of his ways. And then he gives us caution, for the devious are detestable to the Lord. If we have to change the way something is presented for us to be seen and accepted in a certain way, then we have become detestable to the Lord. Think of your fish stories, your big tales, your camping stories, whatever stories you may have, your sports stories. Think of those things that you've told, and as you begin to tell them, they just keep growing and growing and growing. And we're doing that because we're trying to keep our audience with us. And we're trying to keep them entertained. Solomon said when we do that, we've become detestable to the Lord. And wisdom will prohibit us from doing that. God hates devious behavior. And then ultimately, God puts a curse. And what is God's curse? God's curse is the withdrawing of his presence. It says he curses those on the household of the wicked. Those who seek their own gain above everything else, seek their own way, God withdraws his presence from them. Do you remember David's cry in Psalm 51? Take not your Holy Spirit from me. Man, that ought to be my call every single day to God. Don't let your spirit go from me. I want to know that I am serving you, that I am fully and completely surrendered to who you are and where I am at in this experience called life. And he talks about God's mocking. And essentially what it means is this: the one who says there is no God will get what they want, and ultimately they'll be destroyed by it. They want wealth, and they get wealth, and their wealth destroys them. They want fame, they get fame, and their fame destroys them. And essentially what he's saying is God mocks those who mock. In other words, the people who think that they know what they want, get what they want, and find out it's not it at all. It destroys them. And he leaves his son, and then he leaves you and I with this promise. The wise will inherit honor, but he holds up fools to dishonor. I want you to think about your life. Think about my life right now, and think about how Monday looked. Think about your situation, your kids, your grandkids, your parents, aunts, uncles, friends, co-workers. And think about, had they observed you that day, would they still honor you? Think about Wednesday. Think about the places you've been this week. Think about the encounters we've had with others and the way we've treated others. If everyone saw us, would they still honor us? Because Solomon is saying this, that God works so mysteriously that what we do not see is that God is bringing honor in our lives. And so I'm going to close with a little bit of a weird illustration for me here. Garth Brooks, years ago, one of his popular songs was Unanswered Prayers. And you may or may not be familiar with it, but in it, Garth describes going back to his local high school and going to the football game. And while he's at the football game, he sees the person that he thought as a teenager was the only individual that would make him happy. And as an older person, he's now reflecting on his life and the experiences and blessings of his life. And he writes this song that says, "Thank God for unanswered prayers." You may or may not be a Garth Brooks fan or a country music fan. But if you're a human being, you could probably say, thank God for unanswered prayers. There have been times when what we have desired would destroy us. There have been times when what we have sought after, had we gotten it, would have consumed us. And maybe even some of us can say, yeah, I reached it and it was terrible. I got what I thought I wanted and I wasn't complete and I wasn't happy. Solomon gives us this words, tells us what the gift of wisdom is and how that brings us balance and the ability to breathe and function in our lives. He tells us the prohibitions that wisdom brings into our life and how we can't withhold from others and how we should do good to others and care for them individually. And then he says, you better be careful. Wisdom is the caution that keeps you from going the way of the wicked. Proverbs 13, read the entire poem, 13 through 35. Be challenged by Solomon's challenge to us. God bless you.